The golden morning light filtered through the tall windows of Stirling Palace, casting long shadows across the marble floors where Prince William Stirling stood, his hands trembling as he held the letter that would change everything. The official seal of the Royal Council bore down on him like a weight he could no longer carry, and the words seemed to blur before his eyes as he read them for the 10th time. Catherine Wells, his beloved wife of 12 years, sat in the adjacent sitting room, unaware that their world was about to crumble. William had always known this day might come. The ancient laws of Valeria were clear and unforgiving when it came to matters of succession and royal bloodlines. For over a decade, he and Catherine had tried desperately to have children, visiting the finest doctors across Europe, exploring every possible treatment, holding on to hope even when it seemed impossible. Their love had sustained them through the darkest moments. But love, it seemed, was not enough to satisfy the demands of a kingdom that required an heir. The letter from the Royal Council was formal, cold, and devastating in its simplicity. Due to the lack of a direct heir after 12 years of marriage, and considering the pressing need for succession planning, the Council had invoked Article 17 of the Royal Marriage Act. Prince William had 60 days to dissolve his marriage to Catherine Wells and enter into a new union with Lady Margaret Ashworth, a young duchess from a prominent family known for their fertility and strong bloodlines. Catherine entered the room at that moment, carrying a tea tray with her characteristic grace. She had been preparing for their usual morning routine, discussing the day's charitable events and royal duties. Her auburn hair caught the sunlight, and her emerald eyes sparkled with the same warmth that had captured William's heart when they first met at a university charity gala 15 years ago. She was wearing the simple blue dress he loved, the one that reminded him of their honeymoon in the Scottish Highlands. "You look pale, darling," Catherine said, setting down the tray and moving toward him with concern etched across her features. "Is everything all right with the morning briefings?" William's throat constricted as he watched her approach. How could he explain that their marriage, their life together, their dreams, and shared memories were being reduced to a political necessity? How could he tell the woman who had stood by him through every royal obligation, every public scrutiny, every private struggle, that the very institution they had dedicated their lives to serving was now demanding they sacrifice their love? "Catherine," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk." The concern in her eyes deepened as she noticed the official letter in his hands. Catherine had always been intuitive, able to read the political currents of the royal court better than most seasoned diplomats. She had survived 12 years as a princess, navigating the complex world of royal protocol while maintaining her dignity and grace under constant public examination. But nothing had prepared her for this moment. "What is it?" she asked, though something in her expression suggested she already sensed the gravity of the situation. William guided her to the sofa where they had spent countless evenings together, reading, planning their charitable work, or simply enjoying each other's company. The irony of delivering this devastating news in their most intimate space was not lost on him. He sat beside her, still holding the letter, and, for a moment, they simply looked at each other, memorizing features they had known and loved for so long. "The council has made a decision," William said finally. "About our marriage. About the succession." Catherine's hand instinctively moved to her stomach, a gesture that had become painfully familiar over the years. Each month, each failed attempt, each doctor's appointment that ended in disappointment had carved deeper lines of sorrow into their hearts. They had learned to carry their grief privately, supporting each other while maintaining the public facade of royal duty and happiness. "Tell me," she said simply, though her voice carried the weight of someone who already understood that their world was about to end. William read her the letter, his voice breaking at several points. As the words sank in, Catherine remained perfectly still, her training in royal composure serving her even in this most personal of catastrophes. When he finished, the silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of 12 years of marriage, of love, of shared dreams that would never be realized. 60 days, Catherine repeated softly, as if testing the words. "I won't do it," William said suddenly, crushing the letter in his fist. "I don't care about the crown, about the succession, about any of it. I choose you, Catherine. I choose us." But, even as he spoke the words, they both knew the reality of their situation. William was not just a man. He was the future king of Valeria. His decisions affected millions of people, and the stability of the monarchy depended on clear succession laws. To refuse would mean abdication, exile, and the potential constitutional crisis that could tear the kingdom apart. Catherine took his hands in hers, her touch steady despite the tears that had begun to flow down her cheeks. You can't give up the crown, William. Your people need you. Your father is growing weaker every day, and the kingdom faces challenges that require strong leadership. We both know what duty demands. Duty be damned, William said fiercely. What about love? What about loyalty? What about the vows we made to each other? Those vows were made by two people who believed they could have everything, Catherine replied, her voice thick with emotion. But we're not just any two people, are we? We're members of the royal family, and our personal happiness has always been secondary to the needs of the realm. The conversation that followed was the most difficult of their lives. They talked through the morning and into the afternoon, exploring every possible alternative, every legal loophole, every way they might circumvent the council's decision. But the laws were clear, and the political reality was unforgiving. The other noble families were already positioning themselves, and rumors of the council's ultimatum had begun to spread through the palace corridors. As the sun began to set, casting the room in golden twilight, Catherine made the decision that would define the rest of their lives. I'll make it easy for you, she said quietly. I'll request the dissolution myself. I'll cite irreconcilable differences, make it seem like my choice. That way, you can maintain your honor and your position. No, William said immediately. I won't let you take the blame for this. I won't let history paint you as the woman who abandoned her royal duties. History will write what it chooses to write, Catherine replied with a sad smile. But I would rather be remembered as the woman who loved her husband enough to set him free than as the one who forced him to choose between love and duty. That night, they held each other in their bed for what they both knew might be one of the last times. They didn't speak about the future or the practical arrangements that would need to be made. Instead, they simply existed in the moment, trying to memorize the feeling of being together, the sound of each other's breathing, the warmth of shared love that had sustained them through so many challenges. The next morning brought a flurry of activity as news of the situation began to leak to the press. The palace's communication team worked frantically to control the narrative, but the story was too big, too shocking, to contain. Within hours, headlines around the world proclaimed the end of one of the most beloved royal marriages in recent history. Catherine insisted on maintaining her public duties even as their private world collapsed. She attended a children's hospital opening, smiling graciously for the cameras while her heart shattered with each photograph that would soon be captioned as one of her last official appearances as Princess Catherine. The children she visited, their faces bright with hope and innocence, reminded her of the dreams she and William had cherished and lost. Meanwhile, William met with his father, King Edmund, in the monarch's private study. The old king, weakened by years of illness but still sharp in his political understanding, expressed his regret while explaining the impossible position the royal family faced. I'm sorry, my son, King Edmund said, his voice heavy with the weight of his own sacrifices. I know what this costs you. I know what Catherine means to you. But the stability of the crown must come first. It always has, and it always will. Did you ever regret it? William asked. The choices you made for the crown? King Edmund was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the gardens where William and Catherine had been married 12 years earlier. Every day, he admitted finally. But regret is a luxury that kings cannot afford. As the first week of their 60-day countdown ended, William and Catherine found themselves navigating a strange new reality. They were still married, still living in the same palace, still sharing the same life, but everything had changed. Every conversation carried the weight of their impending separation. Every shared meal felt like a last supper. Every moment together was shadowed by the knowledge that their time was running out. The media frenzy intensified as details of their situation became public. Some outlets painted Catherine as a tragic figure, the barren princess whose inability to produce an heir had doomed a fairy tale romance. Others focused on William's impossible choice, portraying him as a man torn between love and duty. The speculation was endless and often cruel, but both William and Catherine maintained their public dignity, understanding that their private pain had become a matter of international interest. Lady Margaret Ashworth, William's intended bride, remained diplomatically silent during this period, but her family's representatives made it clear that she was prepared to fulfill her royal obligations whenever called upon. At 26, Margaret was young, healthy, and came from a family with a strong history of producing male heirs. She was everything that Catherine, at 38, could no longer hope to be. As the days passed, William and Catherine began the painful process of separating their lives. They divided their personal belongings, their books, their photographs, and their memories with the careful attention of archaeologists documenting the remains of a lost civilization. Each item told a story of their life together, and deciding who would keep what became an exercise in choosing which memories they could bear to hold on to, and which they would have to let go. The second phase of their 60-day countdown began with an unexpected complication that would test their resolve even further. Catherine discovered, through her private secretary, that several prominent members of Parliament were planning to challenge the Royal Council's decision. A group of progressive legislators, led by Senator Elizabeth Hartwell, argued that the ancient succession laws violated modern principles of equality and human rights. They were preparing to introduce emergency legislation that would reform the monarchy's marriage requirements and eliminate the heir-related dissolution provisions. This development should have brought hope, but instead, it created a new kind of torment for both William and Catherine. The possibility of salvation made their current suffering even more acute, while the uncertainty of political outcomes left them suspended between hope and despair. Senator Hartwell requested a private meeting with Catherine, believing that the princess's public support for the legislative challenge could sway public opinion and provide the political momentum needed for reform. Catherine found herself in an impossible position. Supporting the challenge meant prolonging their agony and potentially creating a constitutional crisis that could destabilize the monarchy her husband was destined to inherit. Remaining silent meant accepting their fate and watching their marriage dissolve without a fight. The weight of this decision fell entirely on her shoulders, as William was constitutionally prohibited from taking any position that might be seen as influencing Parliament. The meeting with Senator Hartwell took place in a private dining room at the Royal Society of Arts, away from the prying eyes of the press and the formal constraints of palace protocol. Hartwell, a woman in her 50s with the fierce determination of someone who had spent her career fighting for progressive causes, laid out her strategy with passionate conviction. "Your Royal Highness," Hartwell began, her voice intense with purpose, "this is about more than your marriage, though I deeply sympathize with your personal situation. This is about dragging the monarchy into the 21st century and ending the barbaric practice of treating royal wives as nothing more than breeding stock." Catherine listened carefully, her mind racing through the political implications of every word. "Senator, I appreciate your concern and your efforts, but you must understand that any action I take could have consequences far beyond my personal situation. The stability of the crown affects millions of people. With respect, Your Highness, the crown's stability should not depend on sacrificing individual human rights and dignity. The public overwhelmingly supports your marriage. Recent polls show that 73% of Valerians believe the succession laws should be reformed. The people are ready for change." The conversation continued for over 2 hours, with Hartwell presenting detailed legal arguments and political strategies. She had assembled a coalition of constitutional scholars, human rights advocates, and progressive politicians who were prepared to challenge the entire legal framework that governed royal marriages. The proposed legislation would eliminate fertility requirements, modernize succession laws, and establish new principles of equality within the monarchy. Catherine left the meeting more conflicted than ever. That evening, she and William walked through the palace gardens where they had been married, the same paths they had strolled as newlyweds filled with hope and dreams. The autumn air was crisp, and the changing leaves reminded them both of the passage of time and the cycles of life that had brought them to this moment. "She's right, you know," William said after Catherine had recounted her conversation with Senator Hartwell. "The laws are archaic and cruel. Maybe this is the moment for change. And maybe this is the moment for a constitutional crisis that weakens the monarchy permanently," Catherine replied. "Can we really ask the entire institution to risk its future for our personal happiness? Is our personal happiness so insignificant?" William asked, stopping beside the fountain where they had exchanged vows. "Are we supposed to sacrifice everything for an institution that seems determined to sacrifice us?" Catherine touched the stone edge of the fountain, remembering how the water had sparkled in the sunlight on their wedding day, how hopeful they had been, how certain that their love could overcome any obstacle. "I don't know anymore," she admitted. "I used to think I understood duty, sacrifice, the greater good. But living through this has made everything seem less clear. Their conversation was interrupted by the appearance of Catherine's closest friend and lady-in-waiting, Sarah Morrison, who approached with obvious urgency. Sarah had been Catherine's confidant since university and had witnessed every stage of their relationship, from the early courtship through the struggles with fertility and now this devastating crisis. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Sarah said breathlessly, "but there's something you both need to see immediately." She handed them a tablet displaying the evening news, where a breaking story was unfolding that would change everything once again. Lady Margaret Ashworth, William's intended bride, had released a public statement through her family's representatives. In an unprecedented move, she was declining the arranged marriage and publicly supporting the parliamentary challenge to the succession laws. The statement, read by the Ashworth family spokesperson, was brief but powerful. Lady Margaret Ashworth believes that true nobility comes from following one's conscience, not from accepting archaic arrangements that treat marriage as a political convenience. She respectfully declines the proposed union with Prince William and calls upon Parliament to modernize laws that have no place in a modern democratic monarchy. The news sent shockwaves through the political establishment and created an immediate crisis for the Royal Council. Without Lady Margaret's cooperation, their carefully planned solution to the succession problem collapsed entirely. The council was now faced with the prospect of forcing Prince William into a marriage with someone else, a prospect that seemed increasingly untenable given the growing public support for reform. William and Catherine spent the rest of the evening monitoring news coverage and fielding calls from palace officials, legal advisors, and family members. The situation was unprecedented, and no one seemed certain about what would happen next. The Royal Council called an emergency session, while Parliament prepared for heated debates about constitutional reform. The following weeks brought a whirlwind of political activity that kept both William and Catherine in a constant state of tension. Public demonstrations supporting their marriage took place in major cities across Valeria, with thousands of people carrying signs reading "Love over Law" and "Modernize the Monarchy." Counter-demonstrations by traditionalist groups called for upholding ancient customs and maintaining royal dignity. International pressure also began to mount. Other European monarchies, most of which had already modernized their succession laws, issued diplomatic statements supporting reform in Valeria. The European Union hinted that certain trade relationships might be affected by continued adherence to discriminatory royal marriage laws. The global nature of modern media meant that their personal crisis had become an international incident with economic and diplomatic implications. During this period of uncertainty, Catherine made a decision that surprised everyone, including William. She requested a private audience with King Edmund, something that protocol rarely allowed without formal justification. The meeting took place in the king's private chambers, where the aging monarch received her with the warmth he had always shown his daughter-in-law. "Your Majesty," Catherine began, maintaining formal protocol despite their personal relationship, "I come to you not as a princess making demands, but as a woman seeking guidance from someone who has navigated the impossible choices that royal life demands." King Edmund studied her carefully, seeing in her eyes the same strength and dignity that had made her such a beloved member of the royal family. "Speak freely, Catherine. In this room, you are not just my son's wife, but someone I have come to love as my own daughter." "I want to abdicate my position and my titles," Catherine said quietly. "I want to remove myself from the line of succession entirely and renounce any claim to royal status. If the problem is that I cannot fulfill the traditional role of a royal wife, then perhaps the solution is to stop being a royal wife." The king was silent for a long moment, considering the implications of her proposal. "And William? Have you discussed this with him?" "No," Catherine admitted, "because I know he would try to stop me. But if I am no longer a member of the royal family, then the succession laws no longer apply to our relationship. William could remain crown prince and still be married to me as a private citizen." King Edmund rose from his chair and moved to the window overlooking the palace courtyard. "You would give up everything, your title, your position, your role in public life, for love?" "I would give up the titles and positions that were never really mine to begin with," Catherine replied. "But I cannot give up the love that has defined who I am for the past 15 years. "The council would never accept such an arrangement," the king said gently. "They would argue that a crown prince cannot be married to a commoner, especially not under these circumstances. You would be asking William to choose between his duty to the crown and his duty to you, which is exactly the choice we are trying to avoid." Catherine had anticipated this response, but hearing it spoken aloud still felt like a blow. Then, there truly is no solution, is there? Either William abandons the crown, or we abandon each other. There is a third possibility, King Edmund said slowly. Something I have been considering since this crisis began. He returned to his chair and looked at Catherine with an expression that mixed sadness with determination. I could abdicate immediately and pass the crown to William. As king, he would have more authority to challenge the council's decisions and push for immediate constitutional reform. A reigning monarch's political weight is far greater than that of a crown prince. Catherine felt her heart skip a beat. Your Majesty, you cannot seriously be considering abdication over our marriage. I am not considering abdication over your marriage, the king corrected. I am considering abdication because it is time. I am 78 years old, my health is declining, and perhaps it is time for a younger king with modern ideas to lead Valeria into its future. Your crisis has simply made me realize that change cannot wait for the natural order of succession. The conversation that followed was one of the most intense of Catherine's life. King Edmund outlined his thoughts about immediate abdication, the political strategies that would be required to succeed, and the risks involved in such a dramatic move. He also spoke about his own regrets, the personal sacrifices he had made over 5 decades of rule, and his determination not to watch his son and daughter-in-law suffer the same losses. William doesn't know about this conversation, Catherine said as their meeting concluded. No, and he must not until I make my final decision, the king replied. But I wanted you to know that you are not facing this alone, and that sometimes the most radical solution is also the most necessary one. Catherine left the meeting feeling more hopeful and more frightened than she had since the crisis began. The possibility of King Edmund's abdication offered a potential path forward, but it also raised the stakes of their situation to an unprecedented level. If the plan failed, if William became king and still could not overcome the constitutional obstacles to their marriage, then both their love and the monarchy itself could be destroyed in the attempt. That night, Catherine made a decision that would define the final phase of their 60-day countdown. She would not tell William about her conversation with his father, but she would prepare herself for whatever outcome awaited them. Whether they ended their marriage, reformed the monarchy, or watched it all collapse in the attempt, she would face it with the same grace and dignity that had carried her through 12 years of royal life. The third week of their countdown brought unexpected developments that would transform their private crisis into a national moment of reckoning. King Edmund's health suddenly deteriorated, requiring emergency hospitalization and forcing an acceleration of all the carefully laid plans that had been developing behind the scenes. The irony was not lost on anyone that the king's illness, which should have strengthened the council's position about succession urgency, instead created the perfect opportunity for the dramatic changes he had been contemplating. William spent long hours at his father's bedside, while Catherine found herself thrust into the role of unofficial family spokesperson, managing communications between the palace, the government, and the increasingly anxious public. The king's condition was serious, but not immediately life-threatening, yet his doctors made it clear that his ability to continue his royal duties was now in serious question. During one of these bedside vigils, King Edmund finally revealed his abdication plans to William. The conversation took place in the early hours of the morning, when the hospital corridors were quiet and the weight of royal responsibility seemed heaviest. Son, the king said, his voice weakened by illness but still carrying the authority of 5 decades on the throne, there is something we need to discuss about the future of the crown. William looked up from the legal documents he had been reviewing, papers related to the ongoing constitutional crisis that his marriage had precipitated. Father, you should be resting. The doctors said many things, but they cannot predict the future of the monarchy, King Edmund interrupted gently. Only we can do that, and the time for difficult decisions has arrived sooner than we expected. Over the next hour, King Edmund laid out his abdication plan in detail. He would announce his intention to step down immediately, citing health concerns and his desire to see constitutional reforms implemented during his lifetime rather than leaving them as a burden for his successor. The announcement would be coordinated with Senator Hartwell's parliamentary challenge, creating maximum political momentum for change. You want to abdicate so that I can fight for my marriage as king rather than as crown prince, William said, grasping the full implications of the plan. I want to abdicate because it is time, and because I refuse to watch my son sacrifice his happiness for an institution that should be serving the people, not enslaving its own family," King Edmund replied. "As king, you will have the constitutional authority to dissolve the royal council and implement emergency reforms. You will also have the political capital that comes with being a newly crowned monarch during a national crisis." William was quiet for a long moment, processing the enormity of what his father was proposing. "The risks are enormous. If the reforms fail, if Parliament rejects the changes, if the public turns against us, we could destroy the monarchy entirely. The monarchy that demands you abandon your wife is already destroyed," King Edmund said firmly. "We would simply be admitting it publicly and trying to build something better from the ashes." The conversation continued until dawn, with father and son discussing every aspect of the plan, every potential obstacle, every possible outcome. By the time the morning nurses arrived for their shift, they had reached an agreement that would change the course of Valerian history. Catherine learned about the abdication plan that afternoon, when William returned to the palace with an expression she had never seen before, a mixture of determination, fear, and hope that suggested their nightmare might finally have an ending. He found her in the library, where she had been spending most of her time lately, reading about historical precedents for royal abdications and constitutional crises. "My father is going to abdicate," William said without preamble, sitting down beside her among the ancient books that had witnessed centuries of royal dramas. Catherine closed the volume she had been studying, A History of the English Constitutional Crisis of 1936, and gave William her complete attention. "When? Next week. He wants to coordinate with Senator Hartwell's parliamentary session. The idea is to create a moment of maximum political opportunity for constitutional reform. And then? And then, I become king, dissolve the royal council, and spend whatever political capital I have as a new monarch to push through emergency reforms that will modernize our marriage laws." Catherine absorbed this information slowly, understanding both the tremendous opportunity and the enormous risks involved. "If it doesn't work, you'll be a king who destroyed the monarchy for personal reasons. If it does work, I'll be a king who brought the monarchy into the modern era and proved that royal duty includes protecting the people you love." They spent the rest of the afternoon walking through the palace, visiting the rooms and spaces that had defined their married life together. In each location, they shared memories and tried to imagine what their future might look like if the plan succeeded. The uncertainty was almost unbearable, but it was tempered by the knowledge that they were finally fighting for their marriage rather than simply accepting its destruction. The following days brought intense preparation for what would become known as the November Revolution, a coordinated series of political moves designed to transform the Valerian monarchy in a matter of weeks. Senator Hartwell worked with constitutional lawyers to prepare emergency legislation, while palace officials coordinated with government leaders to ensure political support for the reforms. Catherine found herself playing an unexpectedly crucial role in these preparations. Her public popularity, which had only increased during the marriage crisis, made her an ideal spokesperson for the reform movement. She began giving carefully crafted interviews and making public appearances designed to build popular support for constitutional change. One of her most powerful appearances was at a charity event for families struggling with infertility. Standing before an audience of couples who had faced their own heartbreaking challenges, Catherine spoke with unprecedented honesty about her personal struggles and the broader implications of their situation. "For 12 years, my husband and I have faced the pain that many of you know intimately," she said, her voice carrying across the silent auditorium. "We have learned that love does not always lead to the family you planned, but it can lead to a different kind of purpose. Today, we face the possibility that our marriage might be dissolved not because our love has failed, but because ancient laws place political necessity above human dignity." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word as Catherine continued. "But we also face the possibility of change, of progress, of building a monarchy that serves its people's highest values rather than their oldest prejudices. That is why we ask for your support not just for our marriage, but for a constitutional reform that recognizes marriage as a union of love and commitment, not a breeding arrangement designed to produce royal heirs." The speech was broadcast live and became a defining moment in the reform movement. Public support for constitutional change surged to over 80%, and international pressure mounted on Parliament to modernize Valeria's royal marriage laws. Meanwhile, William was dealing with his own challenges as he prepared for an accelerated coronation that would need to take place immediately after his father's abdication. The traditional ceremonies and preparations that normally took months would need to be compressed into weeks, creating logistical nightmares for palace officials and government planners. The most difficult challenge came from within the royal family itself. Several of William's cousins and their supporters opposed the reforms, arguing that changing fundamental constitutional principles for personal reasons would set a dangerous precedent and weaken the monarchy's traditional authority. Prince George, William's cousin and third in line for the throne, publicly criticized the reform efforts in terms that barely concealed his personal ambitions. "We are witnessing an unprecedented assault on the principles that have guided our monarchy for over 1,000 years," Prince George declared in a statement released through his private secretary. "While we all sympathize with Prince William's personal situation, we cannot allow emotional considerations to override constitutional wisdom that has served our kingdom well for centuries." This opposition created additional pressure on William and Catherine, who now faced criticism from within their own family, as well as from traditionalist political factions. The palace became a divided house, with different members of the royal family supporting different sides of the constitutional debate. The situation reached a crisis point when Prince George requested a private meeting with Catherine, ostensibly to discuss family unity, but actually to pressure her to withdraw her support for the reforms. The meeting took place in the palace's blue drawing room, a formal space that emphasized the gravity of their confrontation. "Catherine," Prince George began, dropping the usual royal protocols, "you must understand that your actions are threatening the entire foundation of the monarchy. If William becomes king and immediately changes constitutional law for personal reasons, what's to stop future monarchs from rewriting any law they find inconvenient?" Catherine had prepared for this conversation, knowing that family pressure would eventually be brought to bear. "George, with respect, the foundation of the monarchy should be justice, dignity, and service to the people, not blind adherence to laws that violate basic human rights. If our monarchy cannot evolve to reflect the values of the society it serves, then perhaps it doesn't deserve to survive." "You're talking about destroying 1,000 years of tradition for your personal happiness," George replied, his tone becoming more heated. "I'm talking about ensuring that the monarchy remains relevant and respected in the 21st century, Catherine responded firmly. "The tradition you're defending includes centuries of treating royal women as property, of arranging marriages for political convenience, and of prioritizing bloodlines over human dignity. Those are not traditions worth preserving." The argument that followed was intense and personal, with George ultimately threatening to lead a family revolt against William's coronation if the reforms proceeded. Catherine realized that their battle for constitutional change would require defeating opposition not just from the political establishment, but from within the royal family itself. That evening, Catherine and William made a decision that would define the final phase of their struggle. They would proceed with the abdication and reform plans regardless of family opposition, but they would also prepare for the possibility of failure and exile. If they lost the constitutional battle, they would leave the monarchy entirely and build a new life together as private citizens. "Whatever happens," William said as they stood together on the palace balcony looking out over the kingdom he would soon inherit or abandon, "we face it together. No more impossible choices, no more sacrificing our love for duty. Either we change the monarchy or we leave it behind." Catherine took his hand, feeling the weight of the wedding ring that symbolized 12 years of marriage and the uncertain promise of whatever future awaited them. Together, she agreed, knowing that the next few weeks would determine not just their personal fate, but the future of the Valerian monarchy itself. The fourth phase of their ordeal began with King Edmund's formal abdication announcement, delivered from his hospital bed in a televised address that stunned the nation and captured international attention. The king's words were carefully chosen to maximize the political impact of his decision while maintaining the dignity and gravity appropriate to such a historic moment. "My beloved subjects," King Edmund began, his voice steady despite his physical frailty. "After 52 years of service to the crown, and to you, the time has come for me to pass the responsibilities of kingship to the next generation. This decision is prompted not only by my declining health, but by my conviction that the challenges facing our monarchy require fresh leadership and bold reforms that I am no longer able to provide." The king's speech continued for 20 minutes, outlining his vision for constitutional modernization and explicitly endorsing his son's plans for reform. Most significantly, he directly addressed the marriage crisis that had precipitated the constitutional battle. I have watched my son and daughter-in-law face an impossible choice between love and duty, between personal happiness and royal obligation. This choice should never have been necessary, and I will not allow an institution I have devoted my life to serving to destroy the lives of those I love most. The laws that demand this sacrifice are relics of a darker age, and it is time for them to be consigned to history where they belong. The abdication took effect immediately, making William king even as the constitutional crisis remained unresolved. The transition was unlike any in Valerian history, with the new King William IV facing immediate challenges that would normally be handled by experienced monarchs with years of preparation. Catherine found herself in the extraordinary position of being both queen consort and the central figure in a constitutional battle that could determine whether her new title had any meaning. The irony was bitter. She had finally achieved the role she had been preparing for throughout her married life, but only as part of a desperate gamble that could cost them everything. The coronation ceremony was scheduled for just 2 weeks after the abdication, an unprecedented timeline that required every royal protocol to be compressed or eliminated. Catherine worked with palace staff to plan a ceremony that would honor tradition while symbolizing the reforms they hoped to implement. Every detail became politically significant, from the music selections to the guest list to the wording of the coronation oath. Senator Hartwell's parliamentary session was scheduled for the day before the coronation, creating a dramatic climax to the constitutional crisis. The emergency legislation would need to pass both houses of parliament by a 2/3 majority, a requirement that seemed increasingly difficult as opposition forces mobilized their resources. The Traditionalist coalition, led by Prince George and supported by conservative political factions, mounted a sophisticated campaign against the reforms. They argued that changing constitutional law under pressure from personal circumstances would set a dangerous precedent and weaken the monarchy's institutional authority. Their messaging focused on stability, tradition, and the dangers of radical change during uncertain times. Meanwhile, the Reform Coalition faced its own challenges. While public support remained strong, several key political figures began expressing concerns about the speed of the proposed changes and the constitutional implications of a newly crowned king immediately rewriting fundamental laws. Some allies suggested delaying the reforms until after a proper transition period, which would effectively doom William and Catherine's marriage. The pressure intensified when international observers began weighing in on the crisis. The Archbishop of Canterbury offered to mediate discussions between the opposing factions, while the European Union issued statements supporting constitutional modernization. Other European monarchies found themselves in the awkward position of diplomatically supporting reforms in Valeria while managing their own traditional constituencies. Catherine's role during this period was particularly complex. As the soon-to-be queen, she needed to maintain royal dignity and political neutrality, but as the person whose marriage hung in the balance, she was also the reform movement's most powerful advocate. She walked this tightrope by focusing her public appearances on charitable work and constitutional principles rather than personal appeals. One of her most effective strategies was a series of private meetings with influential women in parliament, business leaders, and media figures. These conversations, carefully orchestrated by her communications team, allowed Catherine to make personal connections while building political support for the reforms. During a meeting with Lady Jennifer Blackwood, the powerful chair of Parliament's Constitutional Affairs Committee, Catherine made her most direct political appeal. Lady Blackwood, Catherine said, sitting in the informal setting of Blackwood's private office rather than in the formal palace environment, I want to be absolutely clear about what we're asking for. This is not about creating special privileges for the royal family. This is about ensuring that the monarchy is governed by the same principles of equality and human dignity that we expect from every other institution in our society. Lady Blackwood, a seasoned politician known for her sharp intellect and careful decision-making, studied Catherine thoughtfully. Your Majesty, I understand the personal stakes involved, but I'm concerned about the constitutional implications. If we allow fundamental laws to be changed in response to immediate political pressure, what precedent are we setting for future crises? We're setting the precedent that our laws should serve justice rather than tradition, Catherine replied. We're establishing that even the monarchy must evolve to reflect the values of the people it serves. And we're proving that constitutional change can happen through democratic processes rather than through crisis and revolution. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Lady Blackwood ultimately agreeing to support the reforms while insisting on certain procedural safeguards to ensure that future constitutional changes would require broader consultation and longer deliberation periods. Similar conversations took place throughout the political establishment, with Catherine and William working to build the coalition needed for parliamentary success. The personal nature of their situation created unprecedented access to political leaders who might normally be difficult to influence, but it also meant that their every interaction was scrutinized for its political implications. The most dramatic moment of this period came when Prince George formally challenged William's coronation in the High Court, arguing that the abdication was invalid because it had been motivated by improper political considerations. The legal challenge created a constitutional crisis within the constitutional crisis, potentially delaying both the coronation and the parliamentary vote. William's response to his cousin's challenge was swift and decisive. He called an extraordinary meeting of the Privy Council, the ancient body that serves as the monarchy's constitutional advisory board, and requested an immediate ruling on the validity of his father's abdication. The session took place in the medieval setting of the council chamber, where centuries of royal decisions had been made. "Your Majesty," said Lord Chief Justice Harrison, addressing William in his new capacity as king, "the Privy Council finds no constitutional basis for challenging His late Majesty's abdication. The decision was made according to established precedent and with appropriate legal consultation. Prince George's objections appear to be based on political rather than legal grounds." The ruling cleared the way for the coronation to proceed, but it also deepened the divisions within the royal family and the broader political establishment. Prince George's supporters began talking about a regency government or even a republic as alternatives to accepting William's reforms. Catherine spent the evening before the parliamentary vote in prayer and reflection, visiting the private chapel where she and William had been married 12 years earlier. The small space, lit only by candles and filled with memories of happier times, provided a sanctuary from the political storms raging around them. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she prayed silently, "let it be guided by wisdom rather than fear, by love rather than tradition, by hope rather than the weight of the past." William joined her in the chapel, and together they knelt before the altar where they had promised to love each other through whatever challenges life might bring. Neither of them spoke, but their shared silence was filled with the weight of everything they had endured and everything they might still lose. The parliamentary session began at dawn, with both houses meeting in joint session to consider the emergency constitutional reforms. Senator Hartwell presented the legislation with passionate eloquence, while conservative opponents mounted equally vigorous arguments for maintaining traditional law. The debate continued throughout the day, with dramatic speeches, procedural challenges, and intense behind-the-scenes negotiations. Catherine and William watched from the royal box, their faces carefully composed despite the anxiety they felt as their future hung on every vote. As evening approached, Parliament prepared for the final vote that would determine not just their marriage, but the future direction of the Valerian monarchy. The chamber was packed with legislators, observers, and media representatives from around the world, all aware that they were witnessing a historic moment. The voting process began just as the sun set over the parliamentary building, casting long shadows across the chamber where the fate of a 1,000-year-old institution would be decided by the voices of elected representatives. Catherine reached for William's hand, and together they waited to learn whether their love had been strong enough to change the course of history, or whether the weight of tradition would force them to choose between their marriage and their duty to the crown. In the moments before the results were announced, time seemed suspended between the old world they had known and the new world they hoped to create. Everything they had fought for, everything they had risked, everything they had sacrificed, came down to the numbers that would soon be read in the ancient chamber where the future of the monarchy would be decided. The final chapter of their ordeal unfolded with the dramatic parliamentary vote that would reshape the Valerian monarchy forever. As the Speaker of Parliament rose to announce the results, the chamber fell into absolute silence. Catherine felt William's hand tighten around hers, and she closed her eyes, preparing herself for either triumph or devastation. The motion for emergency constitutional reform, the Speaker announced in his ceremonial voice, passes by a vote of 412 in favor, 237 opposed, with 18 abstentions. The chamber erupted in cheers and protests, but Catherine heard nothing except the sound of her own heartbeat as the reality sank in. They had won, but just barely. The two-thirds majority had been achieved by only 7 votes, making their victory both complete and precarious. William's coronation the following day was unlike any ceremony in Valerian history. The ancient ritual was modified to reflect the constitutional changes that had just been approved, with new language in the coronation oath that committed the monarch to upholding principles of equality and human dignity alongside traditional duties to crown and country. Catherine walked down the aisle of Westminster Cathedral wearing the same tiara she had worn at their wedding 12 years earlier, but this time her role was different. She was no longer just a princess supporting her husband. She was a queen whose very presence on the throne represented a victory for love over law, for progress over tradition, for human dignity over political convenience. The moment when the Archbishop of Canterbury placed the crown on William's head was witnessed by millions of people around the world, many of whom had followed their story through months of uncertainty and drama. As King William IV, he immediately signed the Constitutional Reform Act into law, formally abolishing the royal marriage requirements that had nearly destroyed their union. But victory came with its own challenges. The narrow parliamentary margin meant that opposition to their reforms remained strong, and Prince George's faction within the royal family continued to work against the new constitutional settlement. Several prominent nobles announced their intention to boycott royal events, while traditional religious leaders criticized the changes as an abandonment of sacred principles. The most serious challenge came 3 months after the coronation, when a coalition of conservative politicians attempted to overturn the reforms through a motion of no confidence in the government that had supported them. The political battle required William and Catherine to spend their early months as king and queen campaigning for the very changes that had made their reign possible. Catherine threw herself into this political work with energy that surprised even her closest advisors. She had discovered a talent for public speaking and political persuasion that had been hidden during her years as a more traditional princess. Her addresses to women's groups, university students, and civic organizations became powerful tools for building support for constitutional modernization. During a speech at Oxford University, where she and William had first met as students, Catherine articulated the broader significance of their struggle. Our marriage was saved not by royal privilege or political manipulation, but by the democratic process working as it should. We asked our fellow citizens to choose between tradition and justice, and they chose justice. That choice doesn't just protect our personal happiness. It establishes that even the oldest institutions in our society can be reformed when they no longer serve the common good. The speech was broadcast internationally and became a defining statement of what historians would later call the Sterling Reforms, the series of constitutional changes that modernized the Valerian monarchy and influenced similar reforms in other constitutional monarchies around the world. William's early months as king were equally transformative. He used his political capital to push through additional reforms beyond marriage law, including changes to succession that eliminated male preference, modifications to the role of the royal council, and new transparency requirements for royal finances. Each change faced opposition, but the momentum generated by their initial victory carried them through multiple political battles. The personal cost of their public victory became clear only gradually. The stress of the constitutional crisis had taken a toll on both William and Catherine's health, and the ongoing political battles left little time for the private happiness they had fought so hard to preserve. Their marriage, which had been the center of international attention for months, now had to be rebuilt in the shadow of their public roles as constitutional reformers. They found solace in quiet moments together, often returning to the palace chapel where they had prayed during their darkest hours. The space had become a symbol of their endurance, and they established a tradition of spending every Sunday evening there together, away from the political pressures that dominated their daily lives. 1 year after the constitutional crisis began, William and Catherine faced their first major test as reformed monarchs when Prince George formally abdicated his position in the line of succession and left England to live in permanent exile. His departure was accompanied by a bitter public statement denouncing the reforms and predicting the eventual collapse of the monarchy. History will judge whether the changes made in the name of love and progress actually served the British people. Prince George declared in his farewell statement, "I fear that in destroying the traditions that have sustained our monarchy for a millennium, we have created the conditions for its ultimate destruction." George's departure was painful for William, who had grown up viewing his cousin as both friend and rival. But it also represented the final defeat of the organized opposition to their reforms, allowing them to focus on building rather than defending their new constitutional settlement. The most meaningful validation of their struggle came 2 years later, when Catherine became pregnant after adopting a daughter from a Valerian orphanage. The constitutional reforms they had fought for meant that their adopted child would have the same succession rights as any biological children, eliminating the fertility pressures that had nearly destroyed their marriage. When Catherine announced her pregnancy at the age of 40, she made sure to emphasize that the joy she felt was not about securing succession, but about expanding their family. "William and I are thrilled to welcome another child into our lives," she said in her announcement. "But our happiness is not based on dynastic necessity. Under our reformed constitution, succession is secure regardless of our personal family circumstances, which allows us to approach parenthood with pure joy rather than political obligation." The birth of Princess Isabella Sterling, followed 2 years later by Prince James, marked the completion of Catherine's transformation from a struggling princess to a confident queen mother. But, more importantly, it demonstrated that the constitutional changes had worked as intended, creating a monarchy that could adapt to personal circumstances rather than demanding personal sacrifice for political necessity. 5 years after their constitutional crisis, William and Catherine celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary with a renewal of their vows in the same chapel where they had been married. The ceremony was small and private, attended only by close family and friends, but its significance was enormous. They had not just survived the greatest challenge their marriage had ever faced. They had used that challenge to transform an entire constitutional system. The anniversary marked the beginning of what historians would later recognize as the golden age of the Sterling monarchy. With the succession question finally resolved and the constitutional framework modernized, William and Catherine were free to focus on the positive aspects of royal service. They became global advocates for human rights, constitutional democracy, and institutional reform, using their personal story to inspire similar changes in other countries. Catherine's memoirs, published on their 25th anniversary, included a reflection on the constitutional crisis that had defined their reign. "People often ask whether we would change anything about those terrible months when our marriage hung in the balance. The answer is complex because while the personal pain was almost unbearable, the outcome was transformative not just for us, but for our entire country. We learned that love is not enough to overcome injustice, but that love combined with political courage and democratic action can move mountains." The book became an international bestseller and inspired constitutional reform movements in several other monarchies, cementing Catherine's legacy as both a royal consort and a political reformer. As they entered their 3rd decade of marriage, William and Catherine had achieved something unique in royal history. They had transformed personal crisis into constitutional progress, using their private pain to create public good. Their marriage, which had once been threatened by ancient laws and political necessity, had become the foundation for a more just and modern monarchy. The final irony of their story was that the institution that had nearly destroyed their love ultimately became the vehicle for its greatest expression. By refusing to choose between duty and devotion, between crown and commitment, they had created a new model of royal service that honored both tradition and progress, both institutional obligation and human dignity. Their love had not just endured, it had become a force for positive change that would influence generations of future monarchs and constitutional democracies around the world. In saving their marriage, they had helped save the monarchy itself from its own outdated assumptions, proving that even the most ancient institutions could evolve when guided by wisdom, courage, and an unwavering commitment to justice.